My name is Adam Reilly. I'm a reporter at WGBH News, and I have dealt with aging parents who live far away, one of whom had a terminal illness that ended up killing him. My father died of ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, right about 4 years ago. And he had actually had colon cancer maybe 12 or 13 years, I'm fuzzy on the exact dates, before he ended up dying, and had a really terrible prognosis with his colon cancer. His first physician told him basically, sorry, there's nothing we can do because it spread to your liver. And then he got a second opinion, ended up getting surgery at the Mayo Clinic. My parents lived, and my mother continues to live in Minnesota, and ended up beating it. And I still remember when he was diagnosed with ALS, him telling me that he had sort of just reached the point. He'd been, without cancer for more than a decade, or had just hit the decade mark, and he had kind of just decided that, okay, in fact, he was cancer-free and was through the woods with that. And then he got the ALS diagnosis. I did not get out to see my father as he was declining as much as now I wish I had. And that's in part because his disease ended up progressing differently than we expected it to. He didn't reach the last stages of ALS where you're lying in bed, unable to move, unable to speak, sort of fully there mentally, but totally incapacitated physically. He didn't get that far because he had been putting off getting in a wheelchair. I think understandably he didn't want to sort of accept that he was no longer able to walk. But when he and my mother were returning home to their place, he ended up falling. We're not sure if he passed out or what exactly happened, but he fell and smashed his face full force on the sidewalk and ended up going into a rehab facility. And I remember talking with him when this happened, sort of shortly after it happened. He sounded terrible. I mean, he sounded like he'd sustained a really nasty brain injury. And then he ended up recovering quite well. He was there for a few weeks. I think he might have spent time in a couple different types of facilities. And I still remember talking with him right before he was discharged to go home, and him telling me, I feel the best I've felt in months. They've been, doing all these sort of stretches with my body while I'm in this place. ALS, one of the things that can do is sort of cramp up your muscles. Your muscles are losing the ability to move. And he sounded almost buoyant. He felt so good. And I think I had this conversation with him the day before he was discharged, and he ended up going home the next day, spending a couple hours being happy to be back at home, and then falling again and smashing his head in my parents' house and going into a coma. He was rushed to the hospital. He and my mother had talked about this. He didn't want to be intubated and kept alive so he could die, sort of the horrible death that you get when you follow ALS to the end. And I was, I think, at that point supposed to, I think I was scheduled to go see them in a week or something like that. And instead ended up coming out and, being there in the hospital room when he died. But I remember, and I don't like to remember it, but I do remember being on the verge of going out to see him when he went in the hospital after that first fall, and talking with, I think, him and my mother about it, and deciding, well, let's wait. Why don't I come out when he's recovered from this and we can have a better visit. And obviously, in retrospect, that was the right call. That was the wrong call. And that, I think, in a way, is emblematic of the regret I have at not getting out to see him more as he declined. He kind of gave me dispensation to not worry about it. I remember another conversation with him where he said, he mentioned to me that his father, my grandfather, had had a bunch of strokes as he neared the end of his life. And at this point, my grandfather was living in Connecticut, where my father grew up, and my father was living in Minnesota. And as my dad said to me when we had this chat, he said, I was aware this was happening, but I didn't get out there to see him much. His life was separate from mine, and I had, my family in Minnesota, and I just didn't make it out there. And it was like he was saying, it's okay that you're not coming out here as much as you might think you should or might wish you had. But while I appreciated him and still appreciate him kind of giving me license to not be out there all the time, I think it was a mistake on my part. For one thing, I just wish I'd been there a little more to give him support that I think it's easier to give in person than over the phone. And then also selfishly, I think if you're a child whose parent is declining far away, I don't think that you sort of come to terms with what's happening with them if you're not there on a semi-regular basis watching it happen. If my parents had lived in New Hampshire where I was born, or in Connecticut or anywhere else, I would have been there on a regular basis and would have seen my father going downhill, would have been able, again, to provide him, I think, maybe some measure of solace or just support. And as it was, I just started a new job. I was working at GBH. That was a new job. My wife and I were poised to have a second kid. We already had one kid. So it was easy to use busyness as an excuse. And maybe on some level, I also didn't want to sort of be there witnessing him getting ready to die. But I do think it was a mistake. And I think that my own processing of his death is still incomplete today, 4 years later, in large part because I didn't make a point of getting out there and being there as this was happening. But that's really, like I mentioned a moment ago, I think that's sort of a selfish way to look at it. I think the biggest regret I have is that he was going through this experience where he knew he was going to die. He knew he wasn't going to beat this or have a miraculous recovery. And I just don't think I did enough to help him through it. So I guess I would urge anyone who's watching this who might find themselves in an analogous situation to err on the side of caution. Do a little more than you think maybe you need to, do more than your parents might indicate they expect you to, because I think when your mother or father is gone, you'll be happy you did. Maybe you won't have some of the regrets that I still do have today.